The room was shaking as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin in April 1945, yet deep underground, Adolf Hitler sat at a table issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Telephones rang with no one left to answer. Maps were moved by trembling hands, divisions pushed forward in red pencil strokes, while outside the bunker, the Third Reich was already dying. In those final weeks, Hitler's last secret orders were not merely commands of war. They were decisions born of obsession, denial, and a collapsing mind, and together they ensured the complete destruction of Nazi Germany. By early 1945, the war was irreversibly lost. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east, and German cities lay in ruins. Yet Hitler refused to accept defeat. Psychologically, he had fused his own identity with the fate of Germany. If he could not triumph, then Germany, in his view, had failed him. This dangerous fusion of ego and ideology shaped every final order he gave. One of the most catastrophic decisions came in March 1945, when Hitler issued the so-called Nero Decree. He ordered the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure: bridges, factories, power plants, railways, and food supplies, as Allied forces advanced. The logic was chillingly simple. If Germany could not win, it did not deserve to survive. This order guaranteed suffering not just for soldiers, but for millions of civilians who would face starvation, homelessness, and economic collapse long after the war ended. It was a decision driven not by strategy, but by resentment and spite. At the same time, Hitler continued to command impossible military operations. He ordered counteroffensives using exhausted teenage conscripts and elderly Volkssturm units, sending them against tanks with little more than rifles in desperation. Entire divisions were sacrificed to preserve the illusion of control. Each failed order led to another, more desperate command, creating a chain reaction of destruction fueled by denial. In the East, Hitler fixated on holding Berlin at all costs. Generals who suggested withdrawal or surrender were dismissed, arrested, or threatened with execution. Loyalty mattered more than competence. Reality itself became an enemy. As trusted advisors either abandoned him or fed him lies, Hitler withdrew further into paranoia. Betrayal haunted his thoughts. He believed the German people had not proven worthy of his vision, and this belief justified in his mind their punishment. Perhaps the most revealing of his final decisions was his refusal to negotiate peace. Even when defeat was certain, Hitler rejected any settlement that did not preserve Nazi ideology. This ensured that the war would continue until Germany lay completely shattered. Millions more died unnecessarily, soldiers crushed in hopeless battles, civilians buried beneath collapsing cities, prisoners executed as camps were evacuated in brutal death marches. Each death was the direct consequence of orders that valued ideology over human life. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere became increasingly surreal. Hitler dictated his political testament, blaming Jews, generals, and traitors for the catastrophe he himself had engineered. He ordered continued resistance even after his death, ensuring chaos would persist. Finally, recognizing that capture would destroy the myth he had built around himself, he chose suicide. Yet, even in death, his final instructions prolonged suffering and confusion across a defeated nation. The consequences of these decisions were immense. Germany emerged from the war physically devastated, morally shattered, and divided for decades. Europe lay traumatized, with tens of millions dead. Hitler's last orders did not merely lose a war, they poisoned the future, ensuring that reconstruction would be slow and painful. His refusal to accept responsibility stands as one of history's most devastating examples of leadership consumed by ego. In the end, Hitler's final secret orders reveal a universal truth about power and human nature. When authority becomes detached from reality, when ideology silences empathy, And when leaders value pride over people, destruction becomes inevitable. The bunker in Berlin was not just the grave of a dictator. It was the final proof that unchecked power, guided by fear and obsession, can turn a nation into ashes. History does not whisper this warning. It screams it from beneath the rubble of a ruined world. In the final months of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler's decisions were no longer shaped by strategy, intelligence, or the realities of the battlefield. They were shaped by denial, deep, corrosive denial, and by an ego so vast that it could not coexist with failure. By 1945, Hitler was no longer commanding a nation at war. He was commanding an illusion, and he demanded that Germany die with it. As Allied forces closed in from every direction, evidence of defeat was overwhelming. Entire German armies had been destroyed on the Eastern Front. Air superiority belonged completely to the Allies. Fuel, ammunition, and trained soldiers were critically scarce. Yet Hitler rejected every report that contradicted his belief in ultimate victory. This was not ignorance. It was a deliberate psychological refusal to accept reality. To admit defeat would have meant admitting personal failure, and for Hitler, that was impossible. His identity was inseparable from the Nazi state. If the Reich fell, so too did the myth of his infallibility. This denial became visible in the way he issued orders. Sitting in his underground bunker, physically weakened and mentally isolated, Hitler continued to direct massive troop movements that existed only on paper. Divisions he believed could counterattack had already been annihilated. Officers who dared to correct him were dismissed as pessimists or traitors. Reality itself became suspect, while fantasy was rewarded. In this distorted world, Hitler was still the genius commander of 1940, still capable of turning disaster into triumph through sheer will. His ego demanded absolute obedience, even when obedience meant certain death. Soldiers were ordered to hold positions to the last man, regardless of tactical value. Retreat was forbidden, surrender was treason, and survival was secondary to symbolic resistance. These commands did not slow the Allied advance, but they did guarantee mass casualties. Young boys from the Hitler Youth and elderly men from the Volkssturm were thrown into combat against seasoned armies, sacrificed not for victory, but to preserve Hitler's self-image as a leader who never yielded. As denial deepened, so did cruelty. Hitler's contempt for the German people became explicit. He concluded that if Germany could not win the war, it had proven itself weak and unworthy of survival. This belief culminated in orders that actively harmed his own nation, destroying infrastructure essential for civilian life. These were not strategic scorched earth tactics meant to slow an enemy. They were acts of punishment. In Hitler's mind, Germany belonged to him, and if it failed him, it deserved ruin. This mindset also explains his refusal to negotiate peace. By early 1945, any negotiated surrender would have saved millions of lives and preserved much of Germany's future. Yet Hitler rejected every possibility that did not preserve Nazi ideology and his personal legacy. Peace without him at the center was unacceptable. He preferred total annihilation to a future that would expose his mistakes. In doing so, he transformed defeat into catastrophe. Inside the bunker, his isolation reinforced his delusions. Surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, Hitler heard only what he wanted to hear. Generals lied to avoid his rage. Subordinates exaggerated successes that did not exist. Each lie strengthened his belief that victory was still possible, which in turn justified even harsher orders. It was a closed system of self-deception, feeding endlessly upon itself. Psychologically, Hitler's final phase reveals a man who could not tolerate limits, not on his authority, not on his vision, and not on reality itself. His ego had grown so large that it eclipsed the nation he ruled. Germany became merely a stage for his personal drama, and its people became expendable actors. Suffering no longer registered as tragedy, collateral to the preservation of his myth. not in words, but in ruins. That ego-driven leadership, unchecked by truth or compassion, does not merely fail, it destroys everything it touches. In March 1945, as Allied forces pushed ever deeper into the collapsing Third Reich, Adolf Hitler issued one of the most devastating orders in modern history, a command that revealed not only military desperation, but a profound moral collapse. Known later as the Nero Decree, this order demanded the deliberate destruction of Germany's own infrastructure: bridges, factories, power stations, railways, water systems, and food supplies. It was a decision that ensured Germany's self-destruction beyond battlefield defeat, transforming a lost war into a national catastrophe that would haunt generations. By this stage, the military situation was beyond recovery. The Red Army was approaching Berlin from the east with overwhelming force, while Western Allied troops were advancing rapidly from the west. German cities were already reduced to rubble by relentless bombing. Civilians lived in fear, hunger, and exhaustion. Yet rather than attempting to preserve what remained of the nation, Hitler chose to destroy it with his own hand. This was not a strategic calculation. It was an emotional verdict. Hitler believed that war was a test of racial and national worth. In his worldview, survival belonged only to the strong. As defeat became inevitable, he concluded that the German people had failed this test. They had not fought with enough fanaticism, not sacrificed enough, not proven worthy of his vision. Therefore, in his mind, they did not deserve to survive the aftermath of defeat. The Nero Decree was the logical outcome of this belief, a sentence passed upon his own nation. The order demanded that all facilities that could be used by advancing enemy forces be destroyed before capture. On paper, this resembled a scorched earth tactic. In reality, it was something far darker. Germany was no longer fighting on distant territory, it was fighting on its own soil. Destroying infrastructure meant condemning civilians to starvation, disease, and economic paralysis. Power plants that supplied hospitals, railways that carried food, bridges that connected cities, all were to be eliminated. Hitler was willing to sacrifice millions of German lives in the name of ideological purity and personal vengeance. This decision exposes the depth of Hitler's psychological collapse. Earlier in the war, he had framed himself as the protector of the German nation, its savior from humiliation and decline. By 1945, that mask had fallen away. The nation was no longer something to be protected, but something to be judged. His authority had become absolute, and with no one left to restrain him, his resentment turned inward. The consequences of this order were immediate and severe. As retreating German forces destroyed rail lines and bridges, food distribution collapsed. Cities already devastated by bombing found themselves without electricity or clean water. Refugees fleeing the fighting were trapped in chaos, unable to move or receive aid. Even after the fighting ended, the damage lingered. Reconstruction was delayed for years because the systems needed to rebuild had been deliberately erased. Remarkably, the full implementation of the Nero Decree was prevented not by Hitler's conscience, but by quiet resistance within his own regime. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, cognized that obeying the order would doom Germany to starvation and ruin long after the war. Risking his life, he deliberately sabotaged its execution, instructing local officials to preserve essential facilities wherever possible. This act of defiance underscores just how extreme Hitler's command was. Even men deeply complicit in the regime understood that this order crossed a line into national suicide. Yet the very existence of the Nero Decree remains profoundly revealing. It proves that Hitler no longer distinguished between enemy and citizen. Power had stripped him of empathy. Authority had severed him from responsibility. The state existed only as an extension of his will, and once that will turned destructive, the state followed. The psychological roots of this decision lie in Hitler's inability to accept personal failure. To him, defeat was not simply military loss, it was a betrayal of destiny. Rather than confront his own catastrophic misjudgments, he externalized blame and punishment. The German people became the final scapegoat. If he could not shape the future, he would ensure that no future remained worth inheriting. Historically, the Nero Decree magnified the suffering of post-war Europe. It deepened humanitarian crises, slowed recovery, and intensified the trauma experienced by civilians who had already endured years of violence. It also stands as a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers of dictatorship often emerge not at the height of power, but at its collapse. When a ruler realizes control is slipping away, destruction can become an act of revenge. In the end, Hitler's order failed to preserve his ideology, his legacy, or his nation. Nazi Germany did not fall with dignity or resolve. It collapsed amid ruins of its own making. The infrastructure he ordered destroyed would have been vital to healing a wounded country. Instead, its loss extended. Dead suffering long beyond the war's end. The Nero Decree is more than a historical footnote. It is a warning carved into history's darkest chapter. It shows how absolute power, when fused with resentment and ideological fanaticism, can turn inward and devour its own people. It reminds us that the most terrifying decisions are not always those aimed at enemies, but those made against one's own nation in the final moments of denial and despair. As the Third Reich collapsed, Adolf Hitler's leadership entered its most dangerous phase, where loyalty and ideological purity replaced military competence, and obedience mattered more than truth. In these final months, strategy was no longer measured by feasibility or effectiveness, but by faith. Faith in Hitler, faith in Nazi ideology, and faith in a fantasy of victory that no longer existed. This transformation turned Germany's final defenses into engines of suffering, amplifying destruction long after the war had already been lost. From the beginning of his rule, Hitler valued loyalty above all else, but in the final stage of the war, this obsession became absolute. Experienced generals who questioned his decisions were dismissed, humiliated, or accused of treason. Those who remained learned quickly that survival depended not on honesty, but on telling Hitler what he wanted to hear. Accurate battlefield reports vanished. Reality was filtered, softened, or entirely fabricated. As a result, Hitler planned operations based on false information, issuing orders that could not possibly succeed. This erosion of truth destroyed any remaining chance for rational military decision-making. Strategy requires flexibility, adaptation, and acknowledgement of failure. Hitler rejected all three. Retreat became synonymous with cowardice. Surrender became betrayal. Officers were ordered to hold territory to the last man, even when positions had no strategic value. Entire units were encircled and annihilated because Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal. Each rigid command led to catastrophic losses, and each loss reinforced his belief that only greater fanaticism could save Germany. Ideology became a substitute for logistics. Hitler believed that willpower could overcome shortages of fuel, ammunition, and manpower. He trusted in symbolic resistance rather than practical defense. As a result, Germany's remaining resources were squandered on hopeless counterattacks instead of being used to protect civilians or stabilize collapsing fronts. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth and elderly men from the Volkssturm were mobilized and sent into combat with minimal training and inadequate weapons. These were not soldiers prepared for battle. They were human shields thrown against modern armies. The human cost of this approach was staggering. Families watched their sons and fathers march toward near certain death in the name of loyalty to a leader who had already abandoned reality. Cities designated as fortresses were ordered to resist at all costs, even when surrounded and cut off. Civilians trapped inside these cities endured starvation, bombardment, and mass casualties because surrender was forbidden. Loyalty to ideology demanded suffering, and suffering became proof of devotion. Betrayal haunted Hitler's thinking during this period. The failed assassination attempt of July 1944 intensified his paranoia and deepened his mistrust of the military elite. From that moment onward, competence became suspicious. Professional expertise was seen as disloyalty if it contradicted Hitler's intuition. Promotions were increasingly based on ideological zeal rather than ability. This shift further crippled Germany's command structure, leaving inexperienced and fanatical individuals in positions of authority. At the worst possible moment. As strategy collapsed, cruelty intensified. Deserters were executed publicly to enforce obedience. Soldiers attempting to surrender were branded traitors. Civilians who expressed defeatism faced arrest or death. The regime's final months were marked by internal terror, as Nazi authorities turned against their own people in an effort to maintain control. Loyalty was enforced through fear, and fear replaced hope as the primary motivator. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. Because ideology demanded resistance until the end, Germany's cities were destroyed street by street, instead of being spared through surrender. Infrastructure that could have supported post-war recovery was obliterated. Refugees fleeing advancing armies found themselves trapped by orders forbidding retreat or evacuation. Hospitals collapsed under bombardment because they were located in cities declared never to be surrendered. The line between military target and civilian life disappeared entirely. Psychologically, Hitler's insistence on loyalty over strategy reveals a leader unable to separate himself from his ideology. Any admission of defeat would have shattered the myth he had built around his own genius. Therefore, loyalty became a mirror reflecting the image he wished to see. Those who challenged him threatened that image and were cast aside. In this closed world, ideology replaced evidence, and belief replaced reason. Ironically, this obsession with loyalty ensured the opposite of what Hitler desired. Instead of unity, it created chaos. Instead of strength, it produced exhaustion and despair. Instead of preserving the Reich, it accelerated its collapse. Germany did not fall because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its leadership rejected reality. Strategy died when honesty died, and once that happened, defeat became inevitable. The final tragedy is that these decisions multiplied suffering without altering the outcome. The war still ended in defeat, but at a far greater cost. Millions died who might have lived. Cities were destroyed that could have been saved. A nation emerged traumatized, burdened by grief and guilt that would shape its identity for decades. Hitler's final phase stands as a powerful lesson in the dangers of ideological fanaticism. When loyalty becomes more important than truth, when belief replaces evidence, and when obedience silences conscience, leadership turns lethal. Nazi Germany's end was not just the result of external enemies, but of an internal collapse where ideology devoured strategy and loyalty consumed humanity. The ruins left behind are a reminder that no cause, no belief, and no leader is worth the price of abandoning reason. Because when reason falls, suffering follows. By the beginning of 1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany's armies were broken, its cities burned, its allies defeated or surrendered. Any objective assessment made clear that continued resistance could not change the result. Yet Adolf Hitler refused, with absolute stubbornness, to consider surrender or negotiation. This decision, more than any other in the final phase of the war, ensured that the conflict would continue until Germany was completely shattered, multiplying death and suffering long after defeat was inevitable. Hitler's refusal to surrender was rooted in ideology and ego rather than strategy. From the very beginning, National Socialism framed struggle as a test of destiny. Victory proved racial and moral superiority. Defeat implied worthlessness. For Hitler, surrender was not a military act. It was a philosophical betrayal. To accept defeat would mean admitting that his worldview was false, that his vision of history had failed and that his personal judgment had led Germany into catastrophe. This was a truth he could not endure. As Allied forces advanced, opportunities for negotiated surrender did exist, especially in the West. A conditional surrender might have reduced civilian casualties, preserved infrastructure, and spared millions of soldiers. But Hitler rejected every possibility that did not preserve Nazi ideology and his personal authority. He believed that a negotiated peace would expose the criminal nature of his regime and destroy the myth he had built around himself. Total war, even in defeat, felt preferable to moral accountability. This decision directly prolonged the fighting. German units were ordered to resist even when surrounded, cut off, and without hope of relief. Battles that served no strategic purpose continued purely to delay the inevitable. Each day of resistance meant more artillery fire, more bombings, more civilian deaths. Cities such as Berlin, Breslau, and Königsberg became killing grounds where soldiers and civilians alike were sacrificed for symbolism rather than survival. The human cost of this refusal was immense. Soldiers who could have surrendered and lived were forced to fight until death. Entire units were wiped out in hopeless stands that changed nothing. Civilians trapped in besieged cities endured starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment. Hospitals collapsed, children died in cellars, and refugees fled through burning streets. None of this suffering altered the final outcome. It only deepened the tragedy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the final battles on German soil. As Soviet forces approached from the east, fear spread among civilians, fueled by years of propaganda and real atrocities. Yet instead of prioritizing evacuation or surrender to protect non-combatants, Hitler ordered continued resistance. Cities were declared fortresses, forbidden to capitulate. Civilians were forced to remain, transforming urban areas into death traps. The result was one of the bloodiest final chapters in European history. Hitler's refusal to surrender also condemned countless prisoners. As concentration camps were evacuated in the face of advancing Allied armies, inmates were forced on brutal death marches. Guards continued to carry out executions even as the regime collapsed around them. These actions were not militarily necessary, they were ideological. The machinery of death continued operating because surrender would have meant acknowledging its crimes. Psychologically, this behavior reveals a man trapped by his own myth. Hitler had promised a 1,000-year Reich and absolute victory. Facing reality would have shattered the image he had cultivated as an infallible leader chosen by destiny. Instead, he chose annihilation. His refusal to surrender was an act of control. If he could not shape the future, he would determine how everything ended. This decision also fractured German society in its final days. While many soldiers and civilians recognized that the war was lost, the regime's insistence on continued resistance created chaos and fear. Desertion increased, punishments intensified, and internal executions became common. The state turned violently inward, enforcing obedience through terror. Even in defeat, the regime demanded loyalty unto death. Ironically, Hitler's refusal to surrender achieved the opposite of what he desired. It did not preserve honor, strength, or legacy. It exposed the emptiness of his leadership. The world did not remember a defiant stand for a cause, but a regime that dragged its own people into ruin rather than accept responsibility. Germany emerged not only defeated, but devastated beyond necessity. When Hitler finally chose death over surrender, his decision did not end the suffering immediately. His final orders demanded continued resistance, ensuring confusion and bloodshed even after his suicide. The war ended only when Germany's remaining leadership ignored his legacy and surrendered unconditionally, an act that saved what little remained. The lesson of this refusal is both historical and universal. When leaders equate surrender with personal humiliation rather than human survival, they transform defeat into disaster. When ideology matters more than life, destruction becomes inevitable. Hitler's refusal to surrender stands as one of the clearest examples of how pride can kill on a national scale. In the end, the tragedy was not that Germany lost the war, it was that it was not allowed to end sooner. Millions died not because victory was possible, but because acceptance was impossible. And in that refusal, history reveals a chilling truth. The most dangerous leaders are not those who lose power, but those who cannot accept losing it. In the final days of April 1945, as the sound of artillery echoed through the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler's world collapsed into a narrow concrete bunker beneath the city. His body was failing, his hands trembling, his mind isolated from reality. Yet even as defeat became undeniable, Hitler's last instructions ensured that suffering would not end with him. His death was not a release for Germany. It was the final act in a chain of decisions that prolonged chaos, confusion, and human misery even after the dictator was gone. Hitler's choice to die rather than face capture was deeply tied to the myth he had constructed around himself. From the beginning, he had presented himself as a figure of destiny, a leader chosen by history. To be paraded before the world as a defeated criminal would have destroyed that myth completely. Suicide, in his mind, preserved a twisted sense of control. He would decide the end, not his enemies. Yet this act of escape came with consequences that reached far beyond the bunker walls. In his final political testament, Hitler did not accept responsibility for the catastrophe he had unleashed. Instead, he blamed Jews, generals, and traitors for Germany's ruin. This refusal to acknowledge guilt was consistent with his entire rule, but in his final hours, it became especially poisonous. By casting blame outward, he reinforced the ideological lies that had driven the war, ensuring that confusion and denial would persist even after his death. Most devastatingly, Hitler's last instructions demanded continued resistance. He ordered that the fight go on, even without him. This was not a symbolic gesture of defiance, it was a command that guaranteed further bloodshed. Communications were collapsing, leadership was fragmented, and German forces were surrounded on all fronts. Yet soldiers and civilians alike were left in a state of uncertainty, unsure whether their surrender was permitted or punishable by death. In those critical days, confusion killed. Because Hitler refused to end the war decisively, countless lives were lost unnecessarily. Some military units continued fighting after his suicide, unaware that the regime had effectively ceased to function. Others feared execution if they laid down their arms. Civilians caught in the middle paid the highest price as battles continued in cities already reduced to rubble. Every additional hour of resistance meant more artillery fire, more civilian casualties, more destruction layered onto devastation that was already total. The psychological impact of this final chaos cannot be overstated. Germany did not experience a clear moment of release or closure. Instead, the collapse came in fragments, marked by fear, silence, and moral exhaustion. Hitler's death did not bring clarity, because he had built a system that depended entirely on his will. When that will vanished, the structure imploded, leaving millions disoriented and traumatized. His final orders also shaped how Germany would be remembered. By refusing surrender and prolonging the war, Hitler ensured that Nazi Germany would be associated not only with aggression and genocide, but with senseless self-destruction. There was no attempt at redemption, no acknowledgement of suffering, no effort to save what remained of the nation. His last act confirmed what history would ultimately judge, that the regime valued ideology over life until the very end. The human suffering caused by this prolonged collapse was immense. Prisoners in camps continued to die as guards followed standing orders. Refugees wandered through burning landscapes without guidance or protection. Families waited in terror, unsure whether fighting would stop or intensify. All of this occurred in a war that had already been decided. These deaths did not change history's outcome. They only deepened its scars. Ironically, the survival of Germany depended on the rejection of Hitler's final will. It was only when his successors ignored his instructions and surrendered unconditionally that the suffering truly began to end. That act of disobedience saved lives, stabilized the country, and allowed reconstruction to begin. In this sense, Germany's future was preserved not by loyalty, but by defiance, a final silent rejection of the man who had claimed to embody the nation. Hitler's end reveals a profound truth about destructive leadership. His power was not merely military or political, it was psychological. He had shaped a system where obedience replaced conscience and ideology replaced humanity. Even in death, that system continued to inflict harm until it was consciously dismantled. His suicide did not free Germany. Germany had to free itself from him. The legacy of Hitler's final actions is a warning that echoes far beyond 1945. When leaders confuse themselves with the nation, when they treat personal failure as national disgrace, and when they cling to power at the expense of human life, destruction becomes inevitable. The bunker was not just the end of a dictator. It was the final proof that absolute power, unrestrained by truth or compassion, leads not to greatness, but to ruin. History remembers Hitler's last days not as a tragic fall of a visionary, but as the collapse of a man who chose ego over responsibility to the very end. His death, close. A chapter, but the suffering he prolonged reminds us that the most dangerous decisions are often made when leaders realize they are finished. And in that realization, the world is left to pay the price.